There's something strange about trees that almost nobody ever stops to think about. You've probably done it 1,000 times walking through a park, maybe on your way somewhere. You brush your hand against the bark of a tree without even really thinking. Just a quick touch, almost unconscious. You feel the roughness for a second and then you move on. Here on Feynman's path, we're going to take that single thoughtless moment, your hand grazing a piece of bark, and follow it down into the physics underneath. And I want to warn you right now, what's actually happening in that moment is far stranger, far more beautiful, and far more unsettling than anything you could have imagined. Because here's the thing, you didn't actually touch that tree. You have never in your entire life actually touched anything, not once. And yet something crossed the gap between your skin and that bark, something that will quietly change your body for the next 7 days without you ever feeling it happen. And the tree itself, the thing you were touching, it isn't what you think it is at all. Let's take this one step at a time. Hold your hand up and look at your fingertips. Think about everything you've touched today, a doorknob, a coffee cup, a keyboard, a steering wheel, your own face. You've made what feels like direct physical contact with the world hundreds of times just since you woke up this morning. But here's what's actually happening at the level of atoms. Your skin is made of atoms, and every single atom has a cloud of electrons swirling around it. When you reach out to touch something, what happens is that the electron cloud surrounding your atoms gets close to the electron cloud surrounding the atoms of that object. And electrons being negatively charged repel each other. They never make contact. The electrons push back, hard. What you feel as touch is actually the electromagnetic force pushing back against you across a tiny gap. A gap that is never ever closed. You feel the pushing, and your brain interprets that as the sensation of contact, of texture, of hardness or softness. But there is always a gap. There is always space between you and the world. Think about every warm handshake you've ever had, every surface you've run your fingers across, every time you pressed your palm flat against a wall. All of it, every single tactile experience in your entire life was the electromagnetic force. A kind of exquisitely sensitive, not quite touching. Now, something crosses that gap. When your hand is near the bark of a tree, something is traveling across the invisible space between you and the tree. Not through contact, through the air itself. And this is where the first piece of hidden physics comes in. Trees are not passive objects. They are not just sitting there. Every tree around you, right now, is continuously releasing molecules into the surrounding air. Not occasionally, not in bursts, constantly. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, every moment of their lives, trees pump a stream of chemical compounds into the atmosphere around them. These are called volatile organic compounds. And that word volatile isn't being dramatic, it's technically precise. It means these molecules are light enough and have high enough vapor pressure that at normal temperatures, at normal atmospheric pressure, they spontaneously shift from liquid to gas. They break free of whatever surface they're part of and drift into the air. The physics here is clean and simple. Whether a molecule can escape into the air depends on one thing: how tightly it's being held by the other molecules around it. There's a tug of war between the molecular forces keeping the substance together and the thermal energy of the molecule trying to escape. When thermal energy wins, the molecule goes airborne. When intermolecular forces win, it stays put. The specific molecules trees release, things like alpha-pinene, beta-pinene, limonene, are light enough and loosely enough bonded that at room temperature, they win that tug of war constantly. They drift off the tree and into the surrounding air. And once they're airborne, they follow one of the most fundamental laws of physics there is, Fick's law of diffusion. Molecules move from where they're concentrated to where they're less concentrated, always flowing down the concentration gradient until things even out. The tree is the source, its surface has the highest concentration. Moving outward from the tree, the concentration drops. The further you are from the tree, the thinner the chemical cloud gets. Now think about the scale of what we're talking about. A single hectare of pine forest about the size of a couple of city blocks releases roughly 5 kilograms of these compounds every single day. 5 kilograms of airborne molecules, drifting outward in an invisible chemical cloud that surrounds the whole forest. In that cloud, the air is doing something measurable. Inside a forest, the number of bacteria per cubic meter of air is typically somewhere between 200 and 300 cells. That sounds like a lot until you consider that in the middle of a city, the same cubic meter of air might contain thousands or tens of thousands of bacterial cells. The forest air is almost medically clean, because these compounds, which people often call phytoncides, are actually antimicrobial weapons. That's what they were designed to do. if designed is even the right word. Trees evolved to produce these compounds because bacteria, fungi, and insects can kill them, so the compounds are toxic to those threats. The Japanese biologist Boris Tokin coined the term phytoncide in 1928, and the etymology is worth sitting with for a moment. It comes from the Greek phyton, meaning plant, and kaido, meaning to kill, plant killer. These aren't aromatherapy oils. They are chemical weapons that a tree deploys in a constant radius around itself. When you walk up to a tree and stand next to it, or put your hand on its bark, you are standing inside a weapons deployment zone. The concentration of these compounds is highest right at the surface of the bark, which is exactly where your hand is. And you're breathing. Every minute your lungs pull in somewhere between 6 and 8 liters of air. With every breath, these airborne molecules enter your respiratory system, cross the thin membranes in your lungs, and enter your bloodstream. Now here's the part that takes this from interesting to remarkable. In 2009, a research team at Nippon Medical School in Tokyo, led by Dr. Ching Li, ran a careful study measuring what happens to the human immune system after exposure to phytoncides. They took participants into a forest and then measured their blood over the following days. What they found was a significant increase in the activity of natural killer cells. Natural killer cells are a type of lymphocyte, an immune cell that patrol your body looking for cells that have been infected by viruses or have turned cancerous. They are your body's internal assassins, and they are extraordinarily important. After just one exposure to a forest environment, the elevated activity of those cells lasted for more than 7 days. If participants spent 2 or 3 days immersed in a forest, the effect lasted more than 30 days. The same study measured levels of adrenaline and noradrenaline, your stress hormones, the ones that trigger your fight or flight response, and found those dropped significantly during forest exposure and stayed lower afterward. Here's what I want you to understand. This is not a mood effect. This is not you feel better because nature is calming. This is a physical mechanism operating through the laws of diffusion. Molecules flowed down a concentration gradient, crossed into your body through your lungs, entered your bloodstream, and chemically altered the behavior of specific immune cells. For 7 days, you touched a tree for a moment, and something invisible followed you home. But that's only the first mechanism. While your lungs were taking in those airborne compounds, something else was happening at the point of contact between your hand and the bark. Something even more surprising. Trees are good electrical conductors, not in the way a copper wire is, but in a meaningful sense. A tree's root system makes direct contact with the soil, and the soil, specifically the surface of the earth, carries a net negative electrical charge. This isn't mysticism, it's physics. Every day, around 2,000 thunderstorms are occurring somewhere on Earth. The lightning from those storms continuously transfers electrons from the atmosphere to the surface of the planet, maintaining what physicists call the global atmospheric electric circuit. The Earth's surface is, as a result, a giant reservoir of electrons. When your skin, which is electrically conductive, makes contact with the bark of a rooted tree, you are connecting yourself to that grounded electrical system. Electrons can flow from the Earth, up through the tree, and into your body. A study published in 2013 measured what this electron transfer actually does to human blood. They found that grounding, connecting the human body to the Earth's electrical charge, increased the zeta potential of red blood cells. Zeta potential is the electrical charge on the surface of a cell. It determines how strongly cells repel each other. Higher zeta potential means your red blood cells are pushing each other apart more effectively. They're less likely to clump together. They're flowing more freely. The blood is less viscous. You touched the bark of a tree, electrons flowed from the ground through the wood and into your hand, and the measurable viscosity of your blood changed. I'm going to say that again because I think it's easy to let it slide past without fully registering. You put your hand on bark. Electrons moved. Your blood got thinner. And there's still a third mechanism running simultaneously. This one is almost a kind of trick your nervous system plays on itself. It has to do with thermal conductivity, how quickly a material absorbs heat from your skin. Wood is a terrible conductor of heat. Compared to metal, it's something like 1,000 times slower at pulling heat away from whatever touches it. Think about what that means experientially. If you grab a metal railing on a cold day, it feels icy cold almost instantly. That's because the metal is aggressively pulling heat out of your hand. Your skin sensors detect the loss of warmth and report cold. Now think about touching wood in the same conditions. The wood pulls heat from your hand extremely slowly. Your skin stays warm. And your nervous system, which isn't built to measure conductivity, which can only measure whether your hand is currently warm or cold, reports warmth. Something warm. The tree didn't give you warmth. It simply failed to take yours. And your brain has no way to tell the difference between receiving heat and not losing it. So the feeling of comfort, of welcome, of natural warmth that many people experience touching wood, that's an artifact of the physics of thermal conduction. Your sensory cortex is constructing a pleasant experience out of the absence of theft. Richard Feynman used to talk about how many of our intuitions about the world are just stories our nervous system tells us to summarize what's happening. Stories that work well enough in everyday life but fall apart the moment you look at them closely. The warmth of wood is a perfect example. The explanation feels like it should diminish the experience, like once you know the mechanism, the warmth becomes less real. But I think the opposite is true. The physical explanation is more interesting than the intuition it replaces. So, let's take stock of what's happening in a single moment when you put your hand on a tree. 1. Volatile organic compounds are flowing down a concentration gradient from the tree's surface into your airways, entering your blood and altering the behavior of your immune system for the next week. 2. Electrons are moving from the earth through the tree into your body and changing the electrical properties of your red blood cells. 3. Your sensory cortex is generating the sensation of warmth based on the thermodynamic properties of cellulose. All of this through a gap that never closes, through empty space, through the electromagnetic repulsion between electron clouds. And the tree is doing none of this on your behalf. The compounds are chemical weapons aimed at bacteria. The electrical grounding is just physics doing what physics does. The warmth is your own heat, not going anywhere. This is what Feynman meant when he said that knowing the physics of something doesn't make it less beautiful. It makes it stranger. And stranger is more interesting. Now I want to turn the question around. Because so far we've been asking what the tree does to you. But what is the tree actually? What is that massive solid thing you just touched? Here's a question that sounds almost too simple to bother asking. A large oak tree can weigh around 5,000 kilograms. Where did all that mass come from? The obvious answer, the one that almost everyone gives without thinking, is the soil. The tree is rooted in the ground, it's pulling nutrients and water up through its roots, and that material accumulates into bark and wood and leaves, right? This is exactly what Jan Baptist van Helmont thought. And in 1648, he ran what might be one of the most beautifully designed experiments in the history of science to test it. Van Helmont took 90 kilograms of dried soil, dried carefully in an oven, weighed with obsessive precision. He put it in a large pot and planted a small willow sapling in it, a sapling that weighed just over 2 kilograms. He covered the pot with a tin lid that had holes punched in it to let water in while keeping dust out. And then he waited. For 5 years he gave the tree nothing but rainwater and distilled water, controlled variables, no other input. He just let it grow. 5 years later, he pulled the tree out and weighed everything. The willow now weighed over 76 kilograms. More than 74 kilograms of solid mass had appeared, apparently from nowhere, in 5 years. And the soil? He dried it again and weighed it. It had lost less than 50 grams. 74 kilograms of tree, 50 grams of soil. Van Helmont concluded the mass had to have come from the water. It was the only other thing he'd added. And that was actually a pretty reasonable hypothesis given what he had to work with. He'd proven clearly that the mass wasn't coming from soil. Water was the only other candidate. But here's where it gets interesting. Because if you apply Feynman's relentless rule, let's actually check the assumption Van Helmont's conclusion starts to crack. Water is H2O, hydrogen and oxygen. Hydrogen is the lightest element in the universe. 1 proton, 1 electron, barely anything in terms of mass. And oxygen, while heavier, is still a pretty light atom compared to what's in wood. Here's what wood actually is. The structural material of wood, what makes it hard, what makes it a solid object that can weigh thousands of kilograms, is primarily carbon. 60% of a tree's dry weight is carbon. Carbon has 6 protons, 6 neutrons, 6 electrons. It is massively heavier than hydrogen per atom. Water has no carbon in it at all. So the question sharpens. Where are those thousands of kilograms of carbon atoms coming from? Not from the water, no carbon there. Not from the soil barely changed. Not from the other minerals the tree absorbs through its roots, calcium, potassium, phosphorus, because all of that combined accounts for maybe 2% of a tree's dry mass. Van Helmont was surrounded by the answer for 5 years and never saw it. It was in the air. Carbon dioxide CO2 makes up just 0.04% of the atmosphere. This invisible, colorless gas that drifts through the air in tiny, tiny concentrations. Van Helmont was breathing it the entire time he was running his experiment. It was floating around his laboratory, and it was the primary ingredient his tree was using to build itself. Here's the mechanism, and this is the part where the physics becomes genuinely astonishing. A tree's leaves are covered in microscopic pores called stomata. Every few minutes, these pores open and close, pulling carbon dioxide from the surrounding air into the interior of the leaf. Inside the leaf cell, a molecule of CO2 arrives at a chloroplast, a tiny structure that contains the pigment chlorophyll. And then something extraordinary happens. A photon of light, not from nearby, not from something you can touch, but from a star, 93 million miles away, arrives at that chlorophyll molecule. The photon's energy gets absorbed by an electron in the chlorophyll. That electron jumps to a higher energy state. It's been excited, loaded with energy, made temporarily unstable. This is real. I want you to hold this image. A particle of light that left the sun 8 minutes ago arrives at a molecule inside a leaf and kicks an electron into a higher orbit. That's actually happening. That's the literal mechanism. The energized electron gets passed down a chain of molecules called the electron transport chain. Think of it as a very precisely engineered conveyor belt of protein machines. As the electron moves from one molecule to the next, giving up a little energy at each step, that energy is captured and used to build molecules of ATP, which is the universal energy currency of biology. Every living thing on Earth runs on ATP. This ATP then gets used to power what might be the most energetically expensive reaction in all of nature, breaking apart CO2 molecules. Carbon dioxide is one of the most chemically stable small molecules that exists. The bonds between carbon and oxygen are extraordinarily strong. Under normal circumstances, they don't break. You would need to deliver a huge amount of energy to force them apart. ATP delivers that energy. The bond breaks. Carbon is freed from its oxygen companions. And then the tree does something with that freed carbon atom. It attaches it to another carbon, then another, and another. It builds long chains of carbon atoms, adding hydrogen and oxygen to form glucose, C6H12O6. And glucose gets woven into longer and longer polymer chains called cellulose. And cellulose is cross-linked and reinforced by an extraordinarily complex carbon polymer called lignin, which is what makes wood hard. That's the tree, that hard thing you touched. It's compressed atmospheric gas. It's carbon that was floating in the air as CO2, caught by a leaf, ripped apart by energy that arrived from a nuclear fusion reaction 93 million miles away and assembled into a solid object. A 5,000-kilogram oak tree is solidified air. It is condensed starlight. It is photons that traveled from the sun, converted into the chemical energy of covalent bonds between carbon atoms. I think about Van Helmont spending 5 years running an extraordinarily careful experiment, looking for the source of his tree's mass. And the answer was floating all around him, invisible, the entire time. He was breathing it. It was drifting past his face. The ingredient his tree was using to build itself was the gas he exhaled with every breath. Here's one more twist. The word gas, the English word we use for any airborne substance, was invented by Van Helmont himself. He coined the term from the Greek word chaos to describe the invisible, unruly vapors he kept encountering in his chemistry work. He was the first person to recognize that air wasn't a single substance, that there were different kinds of invisible matter floating in the atmosphere. He even identified carbon dioxide as a distinct substance, which he called gas sylvestre, woodland gas. The man who named gas. The man who discovered that CO2 was a specific, distinct airborne compound. Spent 5 years trying to find where his tree's mass was coming from, and never made the connection. That's not a story about stupidity. Van Helmont was brilliant. It's a story about how hard it is to see what's right in front of you, about how the assumptions we bring to a problem, solid things must come from other solid things, can make invisible what's actually obvious once you change the frame. Feynman's whole philosophy of physics was essentially this: find the hidden assumption. Find the thing everyone is taking for granted without realizing it. Because that's almost always where the interesting stuff is hiding. Now, let's go deeper. We've been thinking about what happens when you touch a tree and what a tree actually is. Now I want to take you underground, because the story we've been telling has been missing something enormous, something that changes everything about what you thought you were touching when you put your hand on that bark. You didn't touch an individual organism. Let me explain what I mean. In the early 1990s, A young forest ecologist named Suzanne Simard was working for the British Columbia Ministry of Forests. Her job was practical: figure out how to manage logging operations more effectively. Specifically, she was trying to understand why seedlings replanted in clear-cut areas were dying at dramatically higher rates than seedlings that grew up naturally in old forests. The conventional wisdom of forest management at the time was rooted in a competitive model. Trees compete for resources: sunlight, water, soil, nutrients. More resources per tree means faster growth. So when you clear-cut a forest and replant a single species of commercially valuable trees in neat rows with maximum space between them, you should get fast, healthy growth. The seedlings kept dying anyway. Simard had a hypothesis that her colleagues found frankly absurd. She thought the seedlings might be connected underground, not metaphorically, physically connected through a network of fungi in the soil, sharing resources with each other and with surrounding trees. In mainstream forest science at the time, this was not just unconventional, it was considered almost New Age thinking. Trees cooperate, trees share food, the model was competition, every tree for itself. The idea that there might be some kind of mutual aid happening underground struck many scientists as the kind of anthropomorphism you'd expect from someone who wasn't taking the science seriously enough. Simard designed an experiment. She took plastic bags, syringes, and 2 radioactive isotopes of carbon-14 and carbon-13 into a forest. She sealed young trees in the bags and injected the radioactive CO2 so the trees would take it up through photosynthesis. The carbon would be incorporated into the tree's tissues and labeled with the radioactive signature. Then she waited. The key question was simple. Would that labeled carbon, taken up by one tree, show up in a neighboring tree that had never been exposed to it? Hours later, she approached neighboring trees that had received no radioactive gas, that were separated from the labeled trees by soil, and ran a Geiger counter over their tissues. Click, click, click. The counter responded. The labeled carbon was in trees that hadn't been given it. The carbon hadn't traveled through the air. The bags had sealed that pathway completely. It hadn't traveled through water. The isotopic signature was wrong for water-based transport. It had traveled through something physical in the soil, something structural, something connecting root to root beneath the surface. The pathway was mycorrhizal fungi. Fungi that grow into and around tree roots, extending the root system's reach enormously in exchange for some of the sugars the tree produces through photosynthesis. But in forests, these fungal threads called hyphae, individually thinner than a human hair, don't just extend one tree's roots. They link one tree's root system to another, and that one to another, weaving a physical network that can connect every tree in a forest. A single teaspoon of healthy forest soil contains several miles of these threads. A single fungal network can extend across an entire forest, and through this network, things move. Carbon moves, water moves, nitrogen moves, phosphorus moves, and the flow isn't random, it follows gradients, moving from where resources are abundant toward where they're scarce. The same physics that governs diffusion of molecules in air governs the movement of resources through the fungal network underground. In the forests Simard studied, she found that Douglas fir trees and paper birch trees, different species, competing for the same sunlight and water, were exchanging carbon with each other through this network. In summer, when the Douglas fir was shaded by the birch's broader canopy and struggling to photosynthesize, the birch was sending carbon to the fir through the underground network. In winter, when the deciduous birch had dropped its leaves and couldn't produce sugars, the evergreen fir sent resources back. This isn't altruism in any meaningful sense. There's no decision being made, no consciousness choosing to share. It's physics. It's resources flowing down concentration gradients. But the result, at the level of the forest, looks remarkably like mutual support. The network has structure. Forest scientists mapping these connections found that they follow what network theorists call a scale-free topology. A few nodes have enormous numbers of connections. Most nodes have fewer. The most highly connected nodes, the hubs, are the oldest, largest trees. Simard started calling them mother trees, though that name has attracted some criticism from scientists who feel it implies a kind of intentionality that isn't warranted. Here's what the data actually shows, stripped of any loaded language. The oldest trees in a forest are the most connected nodes in the fungal network. Resources and chemical signals flow preferentially through these highly connected nodes. When a highly connected tree is damaged or dying, measurements show a significant increase in the flow of carbon out from that tree into the network, a massive, measurable redistribution of resources in the hours and days before the tree dies. And in controlled experiments, when researchers tagged the seedlings of specific mother trees with DNA markers to identify parent-offspring relationships, they found that mother trees sent significantly more carbon to their own genetic offspring than to unrelated seedlings growing at the same distance. They also grew fewer roots in the areas where their offspring were growing, physically reducing competition for the seedlings that shared their genetics. Simard's work has been both celebrated and contested. Some scientists have argued that the popular presentation of this research, particularly in books and documentaries aimed at general audiences, overstates the extent and significance of the resource transfers. The original scientific findings have held up well, but their interpretation remains a subject of genuine debate. Simard and her collaborators have responded to the criticisms in detail, and the field continues to evolve. What we can say with confidence is this: trees in forests are physically connected through fungal networks. Carbon, water, nutrients, and chemical signals move through those connections. The network has a structure that concentrates connection in old trees. And the resource flows that result have measurable effects on the survival and growth of seedlings. What that means for the moment you put your hand on a tree is this: you didn't touch an individual organism. You touched a node in a distributed system, a network that extends through the soil in every direction around you, connecting what looks like individual trees into something that, in terms of its information and resource flows, functions more like a single extended system than a collection of separate individuals. The line between where one tree ends and another begins is not nearly as clear as it looks from above. Now I want to take you to the end of things. To what finally kills a tree? Because what we've found so far raises a strange question. Trees don't seem to age in the way animals do. They don't run down. So what finally stops them? In the White Mountains of California, at an altitude where the air is thin and the winds are brutal and the soil is essentially just fractured rock, there is a grove of bristlecone pine trees. These trees are ugly by any conventional standard, gnarled, twisted, beaten into strange shapes by the weather. Many of them are mostly dead, grey, bleached wood, a few strips of living bark, some handfuls of dark green needles. The oldest living bristlecone pine is named Methuselah. It is approximately 4,850 years old. Let that settle for a moment. When Methuselah was a seedling, the Egyptian pyramids were under construction. When Methuselah was 100 years old, the wheel had just been invented. Every civilization that has risen and fallen in recorded human history has done so while this tree was photosynthesizing on a mountainside in California. The Forest Service knows roughly where it is, but they don't publicize the exact location because they're worried about what people might do to it if they could find it. And here's what's strange about these trees. They don't seem to get old. Not in any biological sense. Your cells age. You know this. Every time your cells divide, the protective caps at the ends of your chromosomes, telomeres, get a tiny bit shorter. After enough divisions, the telomeres are too short and the cell can't divide safely anymore. It either stops dividing or it dies. This is why you age. It's not a disease. It's a built-in feature of animal biology. Your cells have a clock, and the clock counts down. Tree cells, specifically the cells in the growing layer just under the bark, the cambium, don't seem to have this clock. They divide indefinitely. They don't accumulate the kind of replication errors that lead to cellular aging in animals. Researchers studying ancient bristlecone pines found something remarkable. An enzyme called telomerase, which rebuilds and maintains telomeres, was actually more active in older bristlecone pines than in younger ones. The older the tree, the more aggressively it maintained its chromosomes. At the cellular level, a 5,000-year-old bristlecone pine shows no signs of knowing it's 5,000 years old. So what kills these trees? Not biology, physics. There was another ancient bristlecone pine, possibly older than Methuselah, potentially more than 5,000 years old, growing in eastern Nevada. In 1964, a geography graduate student named Donald Curry was doing fieldwork, drilling into trees to extract core samples for climate research, a standard dendrochronology technique. His drill bit got stuck in one particular tree. It was a big tree, and the wood was exceptionally dense. The bit jammed and couldn't be extracted. Curry requested permission from the Forest Service to cut the tree down to retrieve his equipment and get his sample. The Forest Service approved the request. He cut it down. Then he sat at the stump and began to count the rings. They went past 1,000, past 2,000, past 3,000, past 4,000. At some point after 4,800, Curry realized what he had done. He had cut down what turned out to be the oldest known living organism on Earth. Curry never fully recovered from it. He rarely spoke about the incident for the rest of his career. But the question remains, what would eventually have killed that tree if Curry hadn't? What kills trees when biology can't? Consider what a tree has to manage physically. A large coastal redwood can be 350 feet tall, over 100 meters. It has to move water from roots at ground level to leaves at the top, with no pump, no heart, nothing but the physics of water itself. The mechanism is elegant. Water molecules are strongly attracted to each other, cohesion, and to the walls of the narrow tubes they travel through, adhesion. When water evaporates from the surface of a leaf, it creates a tiny deficit at the top of the water column. The cohesive force of water molecules pulling on each other transmits that pulling force all the way down the column, right to the roots, where water is drawn in from the soil. Think of the entire water column in a tall tree as a rope of water being pulled from the top. The rope has to hold. Every molecule has to grip the next. But water under tension behaves strangely. Pull too hard, and something called cavitation can occur. The water column develops tiny vapor bubbles. The rope breaks. Water transport in that section of wood fails. The physics sets a hard ceiling on how tall trees can grow. The tallest living tree is a coastal redwood called Hyperion, at just under 380 feet, about 116 meters. That's extremely close to the theoretical maximum imposed by the physics of water under tension. Trees don't grow taller not because their biology fails, but because the physics of water transport will not allow it. Then there's the wind problem. The force that wind exerts on an object scales with the surface area exposed. And as a tree grows, its surface area increases as the square of its dimensions, while its mass increases as the cube. So, as a tree gets bigger, it's catching proportionally more wind, while its structural ability to resist, which scales with cross-sectional area, a square relationship, falls further and further behind its mass. A tall tree in a storm isn't just being pushed by wind, it's being used as a lever. The long trunk amplifies the force at the base. The bending stress at the root level increases faster than any geometric growth in trunk diameter can compensate for. And there's the problem of lightning, which preferentially strikes the tallest point in a landscape. There's drought, which can create enough negative pressure in the water columns to trigger cavitation. There's fire, which moves through the accumulated dead wood and dry needles of an old tree. There's disease, which finds its first foothold in a wound created by any of the above. Physics accumulates around a tree. Every ring it adds brings it fractionally closer to some physical threshold. The taller it grows, the more wind load it carries. The more surface area it has, the more lightning risk. The longer its water column, the closer it is to cavitation failure. The bristlecone pines solve this by refusing to grow. They add perhaps a millimeter of wood per year. They stay small, low to the ground, minimal surface area, minimal water column stress. They sacrifice height and volume in exchange for time. 1 ring per year, barely perceptible year after year for 5,000 years. The tree's biology is essentially immortal. Its physics is running a countdown. All trees are caught in this tension. The biology wants to live. The cambium cells divide without limit. The root tips extend. The growing edges push outward without any internal expiration. But physics is slowly, inexorably narrowing the margins. Every year of growth adds to the structural load. Every additional meter of height increases the wind-bending moment. Every additional ring of wood makes the water column one increment longer. Eventually, something gives. A storm, a drought, a bolt of lightning, an insect in a wound, a disease through a crack. And when it gives completely, because the physics has been accumulating for decades or centuries. The cause of death for every tree that has ever died is physics, not the failure of its cells, the failure of its structure. So, let me bring this back to the moment it started. You were walking somewhere. You weren't thinking about any of this. You brushed your hand against a piece of bark. In that moment, you were standing at the intersection of so many physical laws operating simultaneously that it's almost dizzying to try to count them. The electromagnetic force was keeping your skin from ever truly touching the wood, maintaining an infinitely thin gap through which everything passed anyway. Volatile organic compounds were flowing down a concentration gradient from the bark through the air and into your lungs, entering your bloodstream, and over the next 7 days would quietly increase the activity of your natural killer cells. Electrons were moving from the earth through the tree into your hand, changing the electrical charge on your red blood cells and reducing the viscosity of your blood. And your sensory cortex was generating the sensation of warmth not because the tree was giving you heat, but because it was too slow to take yours. What you were touching, that solid, heavy, rough, real-feeling object, was not primarily from the ground it grows in. It was condensed atmosphere. Atmospheric carbon dioxide, captured molecule by molecule through those leaf pores, broken apart by energy that arrived as photons from a star 93 million miles away, and assembled into cellulose and lignin into what we call wood. 5,000 kilograms of the oak tree is solidified air, hardened starlight. The electromagnetic energy of a nuclear fusion reaction stored in covalent bonds between carbon atoms. And below you, invisible, running in every direction through the soil at your feet, a network of fungal threads connecting this tree's roots to every other tree around it. A physical network through which carbon, water, and chemical signals are flowing right now, governed by the same diffusion physics that sent those antimicrobial compounds drifting toward your skin. The tree you touched is not where it appears to end. It extends underground, through that network, into the whole forest. And the tree itself, its cells, its growing layer, its biology is functionally immortal. It has no internal clock counting down. The same enzyme that rebuilds your aging chromosomes runs more actively in a 5,000-year-old pine than in a young one. The biology keeps going. It's the physics that stops it. Wind loads and water column failure and structural stress and lightning strikes. Engineering failure, not biological failure. Feynman used to say that the first principle is that you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. We fool ourselves constantly about trees. We think of them as simple. Background. Scenery. We think of touching one as a trivial, meaningless gesture. We think we understand what they are. But the moment you look at the physics, really look, without letting the intuition slide, what was simple becomes extraordinary. What was background becomes the foreground. A tree is a condensed remnant of the atmosphere, a solidified record of starlight, a node in a distributed information and resource network, a biological immortal in a doomed physical structure. Van Helmont invented the word gas because he kept running into invisible substances he didn't have language for. He discovered carbon dioxide as a distinct compound. He named it. He spent 5 years with his tree surrounded by the answer, breathing it in and out every moment, and he never made the connection. The answer was always in the air. Next time you pass a tree, stop for a second. Put your hand on the bark. You don't have to think any of this consciously. The physics doesn't require your awareness. The diffusion is happening. The electrons are moving. The warmth is doing what warmth does. But if you want to know what's actually going on in that moment, if you want to look at it the way Feynman would look at it, which is to say without flinching, without simplifying, without letting the beautiful intuition substitute for the stranger truth underneath, then you're standing at the surface of something that reaches from the atomic to the astronomical. From the electron clouds that keep you from ever truly touching anything, to the nuclear furnace that built every carbon atom in that wood, to the fungal network threading through the soil in every direction around your feet, to the physics of wind and water that is somewhere out there, right now, very slowly counting down for every tree on Earth. Understanding the mechanism doesn't make it less. It makes it more. It just takes a moment to let that settle. Thanks for spending this time on Feynman's path. I'll see you in the next one. Actually, wait. I want to go back to something, because I think we've glossed over the most philosophically disorienting part of what happens when a photon hits a leaf. Because I said a photon arrives and kicks an electron into a higher energy state, and that's true. But what I didn't say is that this process, the very first step of photosynthesis, the moment that powers all of life on Earth, operates by rules that are fundamentally unlike anything else in the macroscopic world, the quantum mechanical rules. Here's what I mean. When you watch a ball roll down a hill, the ball takes one specific path. It goes from here to there, through a particular trajectory that you can calculate ahead of time if you know the forces involved. The macroscopic world is deterministic in this way. Things are in one place. They go to another place, through one path. Electrons don't do this. An electron in a photosynthetic complex doesn't travel through a single pathway from one molecule to the next. According to the best current understanding in quantum biology, the electron explores multiple pathways simultaneously. It's in a superposition of states, feeling out all available routes at once. And the energy gets transferred through a process that exploits quantum coherence, the electron's wave-like ability to exist in multiple states simultaneously to find the most efficient pathway. This was experimentally demonstrated in photosynthetic proteins starting in the mid-2000s, and the results caused genuine surprise in the physics community. Photosynthesis is almost perfectly efficient at the step of energy capture. Very little light energy is wasted. For a long time, no one understood why it was so efficient, because classical physics predicted it shouldn't be. When researchers cooled the photosynthetic proteins and used ultrafast laser pulses to watch what was happening inside them, they found evidence that quantum effects, specifically quantum coherence lasting for hundreds of femtoseconds, were playing a role in how efficiently energy moved through the protein complex. A femtosecond is 1/4 of a second. These coherences are extraordinarily brief. Whether they're functionally important to photosynthesis at normal temperatures, or whether they're a kind of side effect that happens to exist without doing much, is still being worked out. The field is genuinely open on this question. But here's what's not in dispute. The step where a photon's energy gets converted into the energy of an excited electron involves the quantum mechanical properties of light and matter. Not approximately, not as a rough metaphor. Photons are quantum objects. Their interaction with electrons is governed by quantum electrodynamics, one of the most precisely verified theories in all of science. What that means is this: the tree in your backyard is powered by quantum mechanics. The carbon atoms in its wood were assembled using energy extracted through a process that operates according to the rules of a universe that is, at its foundation, radically probabilistic, non-local, and strange in ways that still make physicists uncomfortable after nearly a century of working with the theory. When you touch a tree, you're touching an object whose existence depends on quantum effects. The warmth you feel, which as we discussed is just the tree failing to steal your heat, is a macroscopic thermal phenomenon. But trace it back far enough, and you end up at a photon from the sun, an excited electron in a chlorophyll molecule, and quantum superposition. The macroscopic world, the solid, ordinary, touchable world, runs on machinery that is, at bottom, deeply quantum. The tree is the visible surface of something invisible and weird, and almost nobody walking past one in a park has the slightest idea. Now let me take you to one more place, because I've been saving something. We've talked about the network of fungal threads connecting trees underground. Simard's work and the research that followed it showed that this network carries resources and chemical signals across the forest, that the flows are biased toward kin, that old trees are the hubs. But there's something about the structure of this network that I find almost philosophically disturbing, in the best possible way. The fungal network in a healthy old-growth forest has been mapped in terms of its connectivity pattern, and what you find is a scale-free network. This is a specific mathematical structure. Most nodes have few connections. A small number of nodes have enormous numbers of connections. The degree distribution, how many connections each node has, follows a power law. The hubs are dramatically, not just slightly, more connected than the average node. This particular network topology appears in 3 other places you might recognize. The Internet. The structure of connections between websites and servers, when you map it, is a scale-free network. A small number of extremely highly connected hubs, think Google, think the major routing infrastructure, and a vast number of lightly connected nodes. The human brain. The connectome, the map of connections between neurons and neural regions, is a scale-free network. A small number of highly connected hub regions and a vast number of lightly connected neurons, and economic networks. The structure of financial transactions, of supply chains, of trade relationships between companies scale-free. These are not superficially similar. They share a precise mathematical property, the power law degree distribution. This topology emerges, according to network theory, from a process called preferential attachment. New connections are more likely to form with nodes that already have many connections, because those nodes are more valuable to attach to. Rich get richer. Hubs get hubbier. Why does this happen in forests? Because if you're a fungal thread growing through soil, and you can attach to a root, the most valuable root to attach to is one that's already attached to many other roots, because that gives you access to the widest network. So over time, fungal connections accumulate preferentially around the trees that are already most connected. The old trees, the survivors. The same logic that makes Google more and more dominant the more people use it is the same logic that makes the oldest trees the hubs of the forest network, not because anyone decided it. Because preferential attachment is a mathematical consequence of how networks grow when connections have value. The forest is running the same algorithm as the internet. Not metaphorically. The underlying mathematics is the same. And this means something about what happens when you lose a hub node. In a scale-free network, losing a random node doesn't hurt the network much. Most nodes are lightly connected and their loss barely affects anything. But losing a hub is catastrophic. A hub's connections don't just disappear, they take with them the shortest paths between huge numbers of other nodes. The network's average path length, how many hops it takes to get from any one node to any other, can skyrocket when a hub is removed. This is why the death of old-growth trees has effects that ripple through the entire forest. It's not a matter of sentiment, it's network topology. Removing a hub from a scale-free network is geometrically more damaging than removing the same number of ordinary nodes. This is measurable. It follows from the mathematics of the network structure. Old forests aren't just older versions of young forests. They have a different connectivity structure, a different topology. They function differently because of that topology, in ways that are mathematically predictable from network theory. When you touch the bark of a very old tree, you are touching the most central node in a network that has spent centuries building its structure. You're at the hub of the web. None of this means the tree is conscious. None of this means the forest is aware, in any sense that word normally carries. What the network does can be explained entirely in terms of physics and chemistry and mathematics, without invoking any kind of sentience. And I think that's important to say clearly, because there's a tendency in popular science writing about forests to let the language slide toward implying something that the data doesn't support. But here's the thing. The physics and chemistry and mathematics are extraordinary enough on their own. They don't need embellishment. A scale-free network that took centuries to build, transmitting resources and chemical signals through millions of miles of fungal threads, running the same connectivity algorithm as the internet and the human brain, that's genuinely astonishing. No mysticism required. I keep coming back to Feynman. He had this way of encountering a beautiful explanation and feeling it didn't diminish anything, not flowers, not sunsets, not human experience. He felt the opposite, that understanding the mechanism added depth, not subtracted it. That the flower wasn't less beautiful when you knew about photons and electron orbitals and the chemistry of pigments. It was more interesting, more layered, more genuinely strange. I think trees are like that. They're already extraordinary as objects in a park or in a yard or on a street corner. Something to lean against or sit under or ignore while you walk past. They don't need any added significance. But when you learn what's actually happening in that bark, the antimicrobial compounds flowing out, the electrons coming up from the earth, the thermal conductivity quietly maintaining your temperature sense, the network extending underground in every direction, when you learn that the solid stuff in front of you is solidified atmosphere built by quantum mechanics and starlight, when you understand that the cells in there have been dividing without limit for potentially thousands of years and show no signs of knowing how old they are, and that what will ultimately end the tree has nothing to do with biology at all, then you're standing in front of something that has layers all the way down. And each layer is stranger and more interesting than the one above it. Van Helmont invented the word gas and spent 5 years surrounded by the answer to his question without seeing it. The tree was absorbing the very substance he had named and using it to build itself, right in front of him, in the pot on his laboratory bench, while he looked for the mass somewhere else. I think about that a lot. How often the answer is right there invisible because of what we assume must be true. The next time you pass a tree and put your hand on it, you don't have to think about any of this. You can just feel the rough bark, the odd, not quite warmth, the texture of something very old and very large. But you can also know, if you want to, that you are standing at the intersection of quantum mechanics and classical thermodynamics, at the node of a centuries-old network, breathing the byproduct of a reaction powered by a star, feeling through an electromagnetic gap you will never close, the surface of solidified sky. The physics doesn't make it less, it makes it everything. Thanks for being on Feynman's path. Until next time.